a technique of setting the URL to match to a certain part of the page.
Okay.
So if you're building a single page application, you might have a lot of different pages that you're showing, but you still want the URL to match where you are in the page so that the user can copy that URL and share it with someone else, for example, or so that they can favorite it and come back to it later. That's essentially, routing helps you achieve that. It helps you route a URL to a specific page, or even if it's not necessarily to go from a URL to a page, it could be also to go from a page to another page through a button or something.
Now this becomes increasingly difficult and important, this concept, now that we have single page applications. It used to be that your route, whenever you typed a URL in, that mapped one-to-one to a page in your server full of either static web content or even dynamic web content that was still page-based. And so you didn't need the concept of routing. But now we're going to put one thing in as the URL, and we may want to decide exactly what we want to happen on the back end as far as what we want the entry point to the code for that route to be, right?
Yeah, that's right. So what we'll be doing with the PizzaBot manager is we'll actually be adding a /conversation / the name of the person that you were having this conversation with, so that when you would route into or navigate into that URL, it would actually pop up the right conversation for that URL. So it will be the entry point, but of course we'll also have the regular home, so just the / with nothing else afterwards that also make that
root route.
The root route, exactly. We'll make that route work as well.
Great.
Yeah. So why don't we get down right into it?
Okay.
So what we're going to do right now is we're actually going to open up our Visual Studio Code. So if you're in the React MVA repository, you can get started again by going to the Module 4 Code Start folder. You can right-click, open with Visual Studio there, and Visual Studio Code, sorry, and then it will open up that repository for you. And what you'll see is basically all of the code that we had from the last module, including the piece that handled the selected conversation. Now, if I actually run this and I go to the browser here, what you'll notice is that I can select the conversation. It will change something in the conversation. So if I'm selecting this one versus that one, it will change the messages. But what I do want to do is I actually want to add a conversation piece right up here. And then I want to be able to select, like the Rami-Sayar conversation and share that URL with someone, and it will pop up this specific conversation that's currently selected.
Okay.
So to do that, I'm going to use a project called React Router. Now, this is a really powerful tool. What I'm going to do here is I'm just going to pop up the GitHub page for you. And what you'll see is that this is a very powerful routing library. It lets you do a lot of different things beyond just the simple routing that we're going to be doing in this project for our situation. You can actually use React Router to sort of embed routes the same way you would embed like components inside each other. You would embed routes inside each other, and you can map a specific route to a specific component in your application, so that it'll actually pop up that component and load everything up for you. So to get started in our specific app, the first thing we're going to want to do is we're going to actually want to require the React Router. Now, if you've been using the package.json that comes with this project, if you do an npm install, that module should be already in your node module, so you should be ready to go. So what you'll want to do is you want to create a require statement right there and go into React Router. And we're going to pull out a couple of things from that module. The first is the browser history. There's different types of browser histories that you can use. There are some that do not take into account like push state and a couple of other things. We're just going to use the browser history object as is. You can choose the type of history that you want for your application yourself if you want that. And then the next thing we're going to do is we're going to start requiring the route object, the router, and the link object that we're going to use throughout the application. So we'll do this real quickly right here. So there we go. And this actually imports everything that we need. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to scroll all the way down to the bottom and actually change how we're going to render this application. So instead of rendering the app component right away, instead I'm actually going to render the router itself. Now this is a bit of a departure from what you would expect, and this is simply because the router is itself a component, which is interesting because it's like, how could a route, this like URL thing, be a component, like a UI component? Well, if you think about it really hard, it does make sense, right? Like the router is gonna be this specific route is gonna be a component, showing a component, right? So it can be a component itself if you think about it. So that's why we're gonna be doing that here. So we're gonna actually be passing in the router component, and then inside we're gonna embed a few routes right here. So let's just give ourselves some space here. There we go. And we're going to set the history to browser history, and that's just going to set up the history to actually take care of push state for us and a whole bunch of other things that you would need in a single page application. And then the first step would be to create a route. And the way that it works is that you are embedding this route component, but instead of just basically giving the end path, all right? So if I'm trying to build this guy, so like the slash conversation slash the human, or the key that I'm passing in as part of the URL. So instead of having like one route, for example, that does this path, okay, like, as you might expect in some other routing frameworks, you might expect something like this. Like there's a one top level component, and then there's another one that's like for conversation.
Yeah, all flat mapped.
Yeah, all flat mapped out.
Right.
So in React, what you actually do instead is you embed them inside each other.
Okay, they're all nested.
Yeah, so you can basically declare what route goes into what route. So it's a lot more declarative that way. And the reason why this is a very interesting change over what exists in other places is that when you're setting this route, you also have to set the component that you want to be displayed at this route. So if you put the component app here, anytime it hits this page, what it's going to do is it's actually going to go to the app component, all right, and then render this component into our object, our element document.getElementById by ID main.
Okay.
All right, and then you also do the same thing for the components on the inside. So here, what we want to do is we want it to basically show us conversation pane, right? But if you look at our UI, the conversation pane is inside the app component, right? So we're gonna actually fix our app component to allow us to do that, to allow the router to create the app component and then inject the conversation pane inside it. So we're gonna change that. But if you think about it from another perspective, perhaps you might have the root page and then you have several like tabbed pages in there. Well, then each tab would be like something inside the main component, and then you don't need to load up the app component and the other components inside those ones. You can just load them all up in one. But in our case, we actually want the conversation pane to go inside the app pane. So to actually change that and make it work, what we need to do is we need to go back to our app component. And if you remember, we were rendering this conversation pane right here. Well, we actually want to remove it now. We don't want it to render anymore. Instead, we want it to take the props, the children that are passed in as a prop to this component.
The app component.
Yeah, to the app component. So the React router is going to take the conversation pane and say that this is the children of this app component and pass it right in. All right, and some of the neat things that we could do here is we can say if there isn't a child that has been passed. So in other words, we were navigating to the top, the top route here only.
Okay.
And we weren't navigating to the conversation route.
Okay.
Well, then children will be empty. So instead of so the or statement here, we can actually tell it to do something else, like maybe select conversation from the inbox. Whoops. There we go. So now, if we actually take a look at the code, you'll notice that we have this set selected conversation. All right, well, that's no longer handy, right? We don't need to set the selected conversation. Instead, we just need to navigate to the /conversation/human, right? We don't need to, basically, we don't need the inbox anymore to set a state object somewhere that then gets propagated to our conversation pane. Instead, we could just navigate to that state, navigate to that URL instead.
Okay.
So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to remove a lot of the code here. This will actually simplify some things. So I just removed the set, in case you didn't see it, I just removed that piece right there. I'm also going to remove this piece right here. This is no longer useful. I'm going to remove the function as well. Set selected conversation, not handy anymore. And then inside our sort of inbox.pane, we're not going to set the selected conversation anymore. We're going to remove that.
I always say the only thing I like more than writing code is deleting code.
Deleting code. It is a weird feeling, but I like it. So that's gone. And then you'll notice how we're simplifying a little bit of our code. And one of the really neat side effects about this is that our components are going to be actually a lot more independent.
Okay.
So you're going to be able to drop that conversation pane anywhere as long as you can give it the human that it cares about.
Okay.
Right. So that's going to be interesting. So now that we've removed all of these pieces, the next step would be to actually take a look at the how to actually get this conversation pane to display the right conversation again. Right. Okay. So if I basically render this, it should render just fine, and it basically should do nothing, right? Because there's our conversation. If I click on this, it should no longer show anything in our conversation box, but I still want it to actually do something when I click on this guy right here.
Right.
So I'm going to replace that on-click event that we had in the inbox item right here. This set selected. It's no longer doing anything because we removed that function. Instead, what I want to do is I want to be able to, add a link here. So instead of using the A, I'm going to use another component, the link component from the router, and I'm going to tell it to go to this conversation plus this.props.index. So this is the conversation. This is the name of the inbox. So if you remember from our previous videos, this is basically passed in as a prop. So I'm going to tell it to instead navigate to this link, conversation slash this.props.index. So if you take a look here, it would be Rami Sayar, for example. But if you notice, we actually have a space in my name. So we're going to want to encode this URI component as well, so that it actually gives us something that we can put in a URL. So once I've got that in, I'm going to also want to wrap it up properly instead of the A tag right here. I want to wrap it up with the link. Now what we've done is we've created this this link. So if I go back into my app, I load my sample data, I can see my link there. And if you look at the hover, it's basically linking to localhost 8080/conversation/Rami the percent sign, %20, that's the space in, exactly, the space in the URL, and Rami Sayar. So if I click on this, it basically does something, and it seems to map to a conversation, but there is an error here because we actually haven't finished the rest of our code. So let's continue to that. What I'm going to want to do now is in my conversation pane, you see how here I have this props, right? Well, that's no longer true because I'm no longer passing the conversation to the props anymore. Instead, what I'm doing is I'm passing it through the state, right? So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to actually change this so that once it's a conversation pane has been injected, it actually will show this.props.param. So that's the parameters from our URL.
Okay.
And then the human ID, right? Because that's the one that I set here. Okay. This, by the way, means that it'll collect whatever's past the slash. All right.
As a variable called
as a variable called human, and we'll pass it in our params. And now, just to make things a little cleaner, I'm actually going to, once this happens, I'm I'm just going to remove this piece of code right here just to show you that it works. So if I go back here and I load again, well, you can see it's already loaded, right? So it hot reloaded my page for me.
Right.
Anytime I navigate to localhost 8080 conversation/RamyCR, it actually shows the proper value.
Okay.
So if I choose Jeremy Foster, it changes my URL and it changes up here my component. Pretty powerful right there. Now let's actually get the conversation to actually show the messages. So to do that, we're going to use some of the lifecycle, the component lifecycle methods. So let's get into that. So we're all going to be in the conversation pane. What we're going to do is perhaps now in the future you might want to load up the data from using an AJAX call or something. But just for our sample app, we're just going to use the sample data and load up the sample data and pull out the specific human and conversation that's in the sample data. But you can see how here it actually should be like maybe an AJAX call or talking to the database or something. So if to load the sample data, we would basically go to samples.humans, the human that we're loading. So in this case, we should take that as a parameter to our function, and then get the conversations out of that object. So that it's accessible within our render function, we want to actually set the state. So we can go this set state, and this is going to be the state only for the conversation component and not for any other component. So this conversation equals this. Close that up. And now this function will never be executed until we execute it from some of the lifecycle methods. So the first one we want to do is component will mount. And there's a specific reason for that. So component will mount, if you remember from our diagram, is basically loaded up the first time a page is rendered. Okay. So what we're going to do is this will basically handle the case where the user navigates from the home page where this component has not been loaded, it has not been rendered, right, to a /conversation/human URL where where the router is actually going to create this component and inject it into the app as a prop. So this is the function. This is the lifecycle method that will be called when it's created for the first time. So we want to actually have it handle loading up the data at that point. But we also want it to handle whenever that the component will be changed. So just to backtrack a second here, when a user navigates from an existing conversation, but like from one at Ramy to conversation Jeremy, well, because the component's already loaded, okay, it's actually not going to load it up again. So it won't call component will mount. It actually will, if you look at the lifecycle method, that path that we had, the function that will be called first is component will receive props. And it will get the next props. So what the props are changing to, like what they're changing to. So now that we have these two functions, what we can do is we can, once we're in them, we can go this.load sample data, and in this case, it will be the stuff that's passed in through the params. So we will tell it to load. We'll call this function load, like maybe sample data is the wrong function to call it, but let's say we called it load conversation data, and it will load it from this param. And here we will do the same thing, but in this case, we will go into what our next props will be and take the params/human from there. So now if I save this and it's already been bundled together, if I go in here and I load sample data, it's actually basically putting in the right conversation. What I haven't done is actually I haven't added I haven't re-added the render message piece. So we're just going to do that right now. We're going to go this.state, and instead of props, it used to be props before. Okay, we're actually going to make it part of the state now because we're setting it in the state. Conversation.map this render message right there. And now it's rendering our messages. If I remove this, you can see it right here. So even if I don't load the sample data at first, if I navigate to conversation RAMCR, it will load the sample data itself to get out the conversation out. Now you can actually structure your app to basically do this properly,
Okay.
And have like every single component that does load up to actually get its own data.
So make them independent, but kind of coordinate the effort.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But right now, so if I navigate into this from scratch, it will actually load the conversation until I load the rest of the data in. And just to show like all of the paths that you could possibly do, if you go into the home page, it does say select the conversation from the inbox. So if I load the sample data and then select the conversation, it changes the URL and it mounts this new conversation pane, and it'll automatically mount the conversation inside the conversation pane.
Okay.
So that pretty much covers routing. I just want to make sure that I haven't forgotten a piece here. Need to double check something right here. Oh yeah, so what happens? So you saw what happened when we loaded a conversation directly, right? So if I did this, it didn't load the rest of the sample data. So just to show you again the power of the lifecycle methods, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to add the same component that we were using. So component will mount because. So let me just add that first, and I'll explain why we're doing that. So even if a user navigates to a slash conversation and then never loads the index page first, it will still create the app because the app component. Because remember, the router down here is injecting this component inside this one.
Yeah.
So it will still call component will mount in the app because that's part of the lifecycle, right?
Yeah.
So what we can do here is we can tell it, hey, if there is a human in this .props.params, because the params object will always exist, but whether there's something in there is dependent on the URL. So if there is a human key inside the params object, well then we can just sort of tell it to automatically load the sample data because we already know that the user hasn't navigated to the first piece right there. So if I do run this, it will also load the sample data right away.
Yeah.
So it's helping a little bit with that synchronization. Now, when you're building your own app, you should be a little bit wary about the strategy that you're using there. You want to make sure that most of the components are independent or are able to get their own data or state unless it's shared among the rest of the components. So it's really up to you. And we talked about this earlier. There's a couple of libraries out there that let you declare the data requirements that you need inside the component. There's libraries like Relay, and it's also built by Facebook that lets you do that. Or you could just do AJAX calls on the get initial state. So it's really up to you and how you manage your data. How you manage your data, getting it from an API or something, an endpoint outside of React. But for what we're doing here, this is a quick way to get this set up.
Okay, so anything more we need to say on routing?
That's pretty much it so far. The routing is pretty powerful. You can actually create some very interesting nested, basically component life cycles based off the routes. Like even this route conversation human could have a further route like inside it that's even more detailed, right? So it's a really powerful way to actually declare the routes that no other framework does.
Cool.
Which is pretty awesome.
Okay, well, let's finish this conversation on routing and talk in just a second in the next video about pure components.
Yeah, pure render mixins.
There you go. Everybody, welcome back. We're talking about React.js, and we just learned all about routing, and we want to talk now about mixins and specifically the pure render mixin. What are we talking about here?
Yeah, so if you think about components, they're an excellent way for you to reuse the code along different parts of your app, like the UI piece. But sometimes even these components have a lot of functionality that is shared between all of them. So to give you an example, we had a component in our routing example that was basically loading up from the sample data, right? But you can imagine that that instead of loading from the sample data, it could have been loading from an AJAX call, like from a REST API somewhere. So that functionality could be shared among multiple components. So what you could do is you could actually use mixins to help you do that. All right, and one of the mixins that is extremely handy in React.js is actually the pure render mixin. So what this mixin does is it basically, if your component will always give the same output for the state and the props, all right, for the same state and the same props, okay, it will skip half the lifecycle method. So it will skip the render method. So if you remember when we had our component lifecycle, you had a method that would get, like component will receive props, okay, and it will give you the next props that this component will get. Well, if that next prop is exactly the same as the previous props, all right, well, then it will skip the rest of that render, right? Because it's just not.
So it's a performance
It's a performance thing, yeah.
Okay.
So that's an example of a mixin that is actually really, really handy. And what we'll do is we'll actually add it to a few of the components in our code.
Okay.
So let me show you how to do that.
So we need to identify what the components that basically qualify?
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, so now a lot of our components here might qualify for this, but to keep things simple and easy to understand, we're going to focus instead on the components that we know for sure will always render the same thing every single time that you give it the same props in the same state. So for example, that could be the store component, right? If you take a look at this, there's nothing that depends on time or depends on anything that isn't passed through the props.
Okay.
Right? And same thing with our message here. This is actually a very, very pure like a pure component. It literally just takes whatever you gave it as the who and the text and then just renders it.
So in other words, I might have a component where I'm receiving the name, and with the name, I'm going to retrieve a bunch of things from state or from a web service, and I'm going to show them on the screen. But then the very next time that gets called, there might be one more thing, one more conversation or message or whatever. So that one's not pure.
No, that wouldn't be pure.
But the store here, I'm passing in an index, and it's the same exact stores.
Yeah.
So that one would be pure.
Yeah, and this message one, for example, also would be very pure because if you look at it, it literally is taking the who and the text that was passed as part of the props.
Yeah, okay.
That's it. So to actually include this mixins in React components, first you got to actually import the mixin. So this one is called the pure render mixin. And it's part of the React add-ons. So you can actually npm install this entire string right here to get this mixin. Okay, and the way that you add mixins to React components is you actually go down to that component that you want to add it to. So for example, our message component right here, and then you pass in a mixins to your object, and what you'll do here is you'll actually add the pure render mixin right here. And that's all you need to do to be able to add mixins into a component. So this one we've added here. Perhaps we might want to add it to that store component as you mentioned, and even maybe our conversation pane. Where is it? Our
not the messages,
the inbox item. The inbox item.
Okay. Gotcha.
If we take a look at this one, it literally is taking everything from the props. There's nothing that it's getting outside. There's no side effect, nothing.
Okay.
So that could be another one that we could add the mix
What are the
into.
ramifications of decorating one of my components with pure render mixin and not having realized that there are actually side effects? Am I going to see that? Am I going to know, or am I going to get weirded
Well, it
out?
just won't update. It just won't. You'll see it because it won't change, right?
Oh, okay.
Right, because it'll skip the rest of the life cycle.
Oh, of course. There's no render because it's not necessary. It'll use. Okay.
Yeah, if you give it the same props in the same state each time, so it won't render the rest of it, right?
Okay.
But you'll know that it's not doing the right thing.
Great. Great.
Right. So that's pretty much it for the mixins. It's a really powerful way for you to share functionality among code. And in our next module, what we'll be working on is ES6, and I'll show you how to use the React classes functionality. It'll change quite a bit of our code because it does function a little bit differently. So stay tuned for the next video.
All right. We're also going to be looking at Webpack and some other tools.
And Webpack and other tools as well.
Yeah, that'll be exciting. So yeah, stick with us. Welcome back. We're still talking about React.js. There's a lot of content here to cover. In this Module 5, we're going to be talking about ES 2015.